Ready?
Welcome everyone to my retrospective on the entire Strider franchise, which was developed by Capcom. First entry was created in the year 1989, initially released on hardware, dubbed as the CP System Arcade. Strider was part of a joint collaboration between Capcom, a manga studio enthusiast, and a veteran arcade developer who brought this dystopian world to life. The first thing we should go into great detail about is the premise itself. The first entry was conceived as a side-scrolling hack and slash based on fast-paced platforming. Strider will use his patented Cypher to slog through multi-layer environments that oozes with a grand sense of verticality. You'll mostly be met with memorable bad guys who tend to become a rampant nuisance over time in regards to certain enemies. They'll either range from painstakingly easy, or the game will resort in scrotum decimation. One prime example is the very ridiculous battle that stems from the anti-gravity boss that you fight in later stages. If you get too close to him, he'll warp you into his anti-gravity field, which causes Strider to lose a block of health for being way too close to him. The first Strider entry was made for all intents and purposes to aggravate first-timers, which shouldn't be quite the surprise. This game was made to be an arcade game, so I'm 99% certain that the philosophy of slathering pain and salt in the wound was their idea of a good time back in the day. My problem is that this doesn't always translate into a fundamental experience, considering how this game was poorly designed in some stages. I had an instance where Strider climbed up a cliff only to fall off after scaling upwards. I had instances where one anti-gravity stage wanted me to perform some routine platforming while Strider remained upside down. This gimmick only led me to getting sucked into deep space again and again and again. This part of the game was just equal to a porcupine crawling inside your colon and living there rent-free for all eternity. It's just something about how they tried to implement things like scaling terrain, gimmick stages, or pitfalls that felt like a shoddy hodgepodge of ideas. This game wasn't bad overall. Lord knows it sounds that way. There's a bit of good that seeps through these faulty areas, which is hard not to appreciate. It's all about style when Strider's frantic gameplay gets the blood pumping. The exquisite flair in regards to presentation is made obvious when Strider parasails into the Kazakhstan capital. There's just so much vibrancy, so much visual eye candy when you get your footing into what is a supposedly frustrating adventure. I would certainly say that Strider 1 is fun to play after some consideration. It might be riddled with trial and error, but I did complete the game after figuring out these very distinctive patterns. The name of the game is adopting to quick situations or dying if you don't. If you played Ninja Gaiden in the past, then some of this gameplay was to be expected in a lot of old ways. There are things to assist you. I specifically forgot to mention like some simple techniques. Strider can slide under projectiles as a move to avoid traps or enemies firing at him horizontally. Power-ups are littered throughout the game, so Strider himself isn't completely unprepared for battle. You can gain helper droids, which are labeled as options. These options include the ability to summon laser droids that shoot enemies, a hawk that destroys airborne foes, and a panther that lunges at enemies close to Strider. You can have all three options available at once, which is only lost if you take one hit. Everything else is pretty much standard, like 1-ups, Cypher blade extensions, along with routine invincibility. The option droids are like a personal favorite because who wouldn't want a Robo Panther war ripping through enemies like a wet paper bag? The game was met with a few ports due to the acknowledged praise that the original got in the mainstream media. I will do my best to list some of them in passing, although you shouldn't hold it against me if I don't cover them all. The first port that I know of is from the Sega Mega Drive, which is nearly identical to the original except for a few key changes. That terrible upside down anti-gravity room seems to be all but removed in the Genesis port, thank God. Some stages have been altered as well, like the giant warship for instance. You have to kill 3 sisters before progressing to a new area instead of killing the pilot and ending the level immediately. This makes sense, since they probably wanted you to witness the work that went into the bosses over just blitzing through and killing the pilot and slicing through him like a hot knife through butter. The PS1 version is also pretty much the same game, with the exception that adds a few tweaks. Namely, you'll notice things like cutting off the stage timer, a difficulty slider, or remixing the crappier soundtrack that was redone for the PS1 version. Believe me when I say that the remix themes pale in comparison to the original Strider. Speaking of comparisons, I would say that the arcade version felt a little bit more fluid than the PS1 rendition, so this is why I'm so thankful for grabbing footage between both games. I'll just sit here and let you judge that notion accordingly. The NES version is almost like a completely different game. The verticality is even worse and the sense of direction is even more cryptic than usual. I found myself enjoying this version less than usual. The soundtrack was worth the price of admission, although Strider 1 was a sleeper hit amongst the public eye. It was a game that had a few hurdles, but it wore its acrobatic prowess like a huge badge of honor. I can thoroughly respect that, plus I would say that if you really want to play these games, then do so like I did. Boot up like some old RetroArch or get a copy going possibly with a buddy, because I just realized that Strider 1 probably is the only game in the series that utilized 2-player co-op. If you go to Capcom Arcade Stadium and you look up Strider 1, you will see in the description that it says 1 to 2-player co-op tag team action. I wonder why later Strider iterations decided to take out the co-op. The game was probably way too fast to handle 2 people if I am guesstimating in general, and no, that is not a sexual connotation. I haven't tried this mode personally, but you're welcome to experiment since the feature is readily available upon booting the game. Before a legit follow-up to Strider 1 was even a reality on the PlayStation, we have to talk about Tier Text Design Studios. This studio was commissioned to work on a supposed follow-up by a publisher named US Gold. The problem was that this wasn't the same branch as Capcom, meaning this was outsourced to another team entirely. This situation also happened with Hideo Kojima. Remember where he made Metal Gear back in the past, and then they put it on the NES, and then they made a follow-up called Metal Gear Snake's Revenge. Yeah, that happened, and that was completely non-canon to the original Metal Gear. Thus, he made Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, and there we have it. Same situation. This game that emerged from the steaming pile that was the supposed Strider 2 was called Journey from Darkness Strider Returns. This game was thoroughly slammed as disappointing due to being riddled with slowdown, technical issues, and overall just being a sloppy attempt at banking off the popularity from the first game, and it was rightfully unearned. I mean, look at some of this gameplay. There's so many reused screenshots from the original game that it almost seems mind-boggling that this game was created. Non-canon sequels that were outsourced were far from a surprise back in those days. Hell, it even happened to Blaster Master as well, because, I mean, let's forget that Blaster Master 2 even existed, but sadly, that's another red mark in history that we like to forget about. It's just a shame that it happened with Strider in general, because the original did not deserve such a black sheep added to his history. Strider Returns was so unmemorable that Capcom just proceeded with their own true follow-up years later with Strider 2 on the PlayStation 1. The year of 1999 was red hot and booming for gaming. We had Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, we had Silent Hill, we of course had the infamous Dino Crisis, and we also had Strider 2. Strider 2 was unveiled to the world on December of 1999. The basic gameplay principles of Strider 1 mostly remained the same in the sequel, but amplified to a greater extent. Hiryu can now walk, jump, crouch, slide, and climb walls and ceilings like he could in the original experience. This also created a higher sense of speed and velocity when fighting against bosses. It's almost like they upped the ante completely in that department. The cool hip thing that distinguishes Strider 2 from the first iteration was adding in more 3D backdrops. Bosses, landscapes, and items all featured this redesign. It was no different when Hiryu himself came into the picture. Strider was given a new blue gi and a red scarf that accommodated him greatly. There are some new boost gauges that were added to the mix, like an additional power meter when you attack enemies. Plasma shots would also do increased damage over time, as well as adding in an additional move for invincibility frames. It was called the Savage Slash. And what would happen is Strider would leap into the air with a pair of circular slashes, raining down blows on anyone in close proximity. There was a lot more personality that came from this game, like a more elaborate setup and level design. Like, one level is a prime example in an area where you fight these three twin sisters. These sisters would jump together on moving platforms of trains. Your goal is to kill them while you're all trying to fight on top of these like moving cars and trains and platforms in the area. So once you kill them, the stage will end. It's just a lot of thought, time, and ingenuity went into programming this particular stage because it's so vast in the first place, even if it's presented as a small segment. Power-ups were the norm, like Cypher extensions and health upgrades, the works. Everything that you got in the previous game, you got it in this one and then some. You name it, the exploration itself also accommodated all the player curiosity. The bare bones plot within this game isn't anything worth writing home about at all. You are a genetic experiment and a clone version of the original Strider. Somehow, Palpatine has returned.
Hello, Star Wars Weekends fans. How you doing?
I mean, somehow Grandmaster Mio has returned. Thus, you must deliver the swift cipher of justice right into this old man's heart.
I'ma penetrate this man's soul with my heart.
What?
Yeah.
How deep you think you got in his soul?
Once again, nothing really too spectacular for the Strider plot. Just a cooler set of bosses, enemies, and showdowns that will make you want to go toe to toe. Strider 2 was a fantastic experience when I got my hands on it. There's just one lingering problem that very much cripples the game. The replay value is extremely short. I'm talking even shorter for games around this time like Resident Evil, and those were pretty short experiences. I'm talking like those were like 4 to 6 hours. With Strider 2, if you're really good at hack and slash platforming, then you're looking at a game that might be 30 minutes to an hour. Capcom knew this was an issue, so as a result, they tried making Strider 2 into a content-rich package. You get Strider 2, you get Strider 1, and you get a bonus hidden character in this second iteration. Strider Heian has a mode called Heian Mode. Heian himself seems to act like a rival for Strider Hiryu in the story. With every X, there needs to be a zero, right? Well, this guy certainly is no different upon how he acts. He reminds his merrymen that he is a special A-class survivor that warns Hiryu not to go after Grandmaster Mio. He really almost acts like a servant to a global worldwide terrorist. Hiryu defeats him near the end of the game, and huzzah! Brand new character who doesn't play by the Hiryu rulebook. Hien is basically identical to Strider Hiryu. The only exception is that he has more damaging and ferocious Cypher attacks and a boomerang style projectile. This thing will kill and it still will hit hard. I mean, I'm talking, it will consistently lock on to bosses no matter what they do, so maybe they should dub Hien mode as easy mode instead, right? Either way, Strider 2 is closed for the record books. Lacking on content? Well, you know, in terms of main story, they don't have much to go on, but it is a more refined game than the previous iteration of Strider 1. Strider wouldn't get any sort of continuation or new entry until 2014. This is when Double Helix released their reboot of the Strider franchise. The best way to describe this version for Strider is best summarized with scope. It made a distinctive shift to Metroidvania where there's a big 2.5D map to explore. The Kazakh region blurs with an urban dictator on the radio that sets up this bleak, terrifying, and dystopian world. As a fan of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, it's very easy for me to claim that I like this iteration of Strider. This story is essentially a reimagining and retelling at the same time. Grandmaster Mio does some shit that we don't like, and it's time to kick his ass. The bigger region really made the game a lot more lengthier, giving you a lot more liberties for puzzle solving, exploring, and combat. Strider has more options regarding defense or offense now. Things like a robotic eagle being able to transport Strider quickly through the area. You also have bullet reflection, missile protection, and Cypher slashes that can reach enemies from halfway across the screen now. All these things are very integral to survival because there are a lot more boss encounters in this game than you can fathom. Even a lot more than the second game. Of course, there's more retold enemies that come straight from the second and first game respectively, especially the Chinese sisters that pop up. This gave me a bigger sense of urgency as well as appreciating the presentation. They gave more voice acting to the characters, more of this like sense of characterization and how they talk and attack Strider. This made everything feel more alive in the world. The team wanted a clearer sense of progression on variety than anything else. This is thoroughly explained on the shift to Metroidvania. This is from one of the developers, I quote, and this is something I came up with when I was working on the concept phase. I wanted to really do a new Strider because it had been so long and I know people want it. But what could we do to make this happen? One of the initial challenges is that both the first two games were coin-op games and they were all about quarter munching. They were super difficult, so you die often and you have to keep putting in money. If you played them from start to finish, they're both 30 to 45 minutes long. How do you take that and turn it into a 6-hour console game? Even though we're a digital download title, we still wanted to have a robust campaign that lasts about that long. You can't make a totally linear 30-minute game and expect people to enjoy that in this day and age. The idea of bringing in that map design and that larger world that you can traverse through, to me, was sort of that aha moment. This is how we do it. Luckily, they didn't want to sap Strider's powers away, as some Metroidvanias have done in the past. Strider can still do everything he could in the previous iterations while performing the same acrobatics that you come to know and love. This version received favorable reviews amongst the community. I remember the cross-generational leap when the PS3 version had 30 FPS and the PS4 version had 60. We haven't seen Hiryu in a long time since then. He's mostly been a regular in fighting games here or there, showing up in a lot of crossovers like Marvel vs. Capcom. Wherever Mr. Strider will go, I will follow. It seems like once in a blue moon to see more Strider games. Hopefully with the new RE engine modifications that debut with Street Fighter 6, we can see some clarity in covering more stylized games, whether it be Mega Man, Strider, or Bionic Commando. The past has never left our hearts, and Strider Hiryu didn't either. Also, I just found out that Grin, the studio that made the Bionic Commando reboot, was planning to make a Strider revival in 2009 before it got cancelled. I wonder how that would have turned out.
Go ahead. Take it from me.